Hi, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. I'm back here with Inez. Last week we left you all previewing the coming SFFA, the Harvard decision. We speculated that it might be out like the next day, and it was. The Supreme Court had a decision the day after we released the podcast. I've written two articles on this now, and I did a tweet thread on the whole, pretty much the whole decision. So I think my takes are out there. I know you've tweeted about it, Inez, too. Is there anything sort of that you think is notable?
Yeah, I mean, I think we got into it a little bit last time, but I'm curious to see how much of this reasoning ends up being transplanted into outside of the university context, because universities are going to fight this tooth and nail. I think there are some good ways to make them fall in line, one of which is continuing to bring these kinds of cases, but others of which might be open to a potential Republican administration. Unlike in K-12, there are a lot of bureaucratic levers that can be enforced, a lot of riders that can be put on funding, a lot of investigations that can be launched from the OCR office in the Department of Education. So actually, I think there are a lot of bureaucratic tools to enforce this kind of ruling. I think that would be a good thing for a competent Republican administration to do. Whether we're likely to get a Republican administration, or most especially a competent Republican administration, is open to question, I think. But it's possible. But I'm really excited, potentially, which is an unusual state for me, about the future of the country, uh, based on how much cross pollination there is with analysis under the Equal Protection Clause versus Title VII versus under all of these civil rights statutes, right? If we were to start getting really aggressive about enforcing a colorblind standard in American corporations, I think that could undo a lot of the cover your ass sort of initial move in the 1990s with the changes to the law, in terms of providing an equal and opposite cover your ass incentive for companies on the other end to be racially neutral in hiring and promotion. So that's, I think, what would be most exciting. This doesn't necessarily legally derive directly from this case, but as I said, and as you know, that kind of legal analysis between between constitutional analysis, the statute analysis, and the CRA, et cetera, certain constructs or judicial phrases or terms of art tend to jump from one to the other. And I would hope that, because in principle, right, it's the same thing. It is actually guaranteeing equal treatment under the law, and guaranteeing that people are not being rewarded or punished on the basis of their skin color.
Yeah, yeah. The decision, and people talk about the decision. How much will it matter? Will they just get around it? Um, the way the civil rights sort of regime and the bureaucracy has built up over the years, and the rules and sort of the practice of everything, it's not like there's one decision and then everything changes, right? It's like the courts do one thing that's incremental, and then like it sends a message as to like what the court will do next time, and then the bureaucrats and then the lawyers and the judges, they all sort of build on that. And so we have this thing that where the Supreme Court's rule 6-3 that Harvard and UNC can't consider race in college admissions. And in theory, you're as you alluded to, it wouldn't. In theory, it might not matter. You think it might not matter for something like Title VII, which is employment law. Or Title VI in other contexts outside of college admissions. And left-wing lawyers in the future will be arguing that they will be doing the thing that lawyers do, which is find whatever they can in the case to say this argument is very, very specific to college admissions for whatever reason. Oh, it's because it has to do with Asians or something like that. They could find something. But yeah, in the real world, I mean, this is going to matter. I mean, I don't know if you saw the Aaron Severium piece in the last day or two about the Columbia Law Journal. They have racial quotas on their law review. And now they're like delaying the announcement. They want to make sure that, they can actually just, have racial quotas. So there's these effects on institutions. And yeah, it is exciting. I mean, I think that the universities, people are like, oh, they're gonna get around it. The problem with the universities is that they're bad people and they're crazy, right? Like we know that. We know they are like the most ideologically committed people to left wing ideas on race and gender. So like, there's only so much you can do in that, in that world. They're going to do bad things and they're going to do things that a lot of people don't like and the me and you are not going to like. And that's something we're going to have to deal with. But the rest of society, everything around the universities, K through 12, too much. You said there aren't a lot of levers for K through 12. I think there are a lot. I mean, it's the same lever that you have for the universities. It's Title VI. That's, you could use a lot of, you could use the exact same legal mechanisms, right?
Um, yes and no, in the sense that yes, there are legal hooks, especially when you're talking about anti-discrimination. Um, but there are many fewer bureaucratic hooks because the amount of money that's coming out of the federal treasury to go to education in K-12 is much less. So before COVID, and COVID changed these numbers a little bit, but hopefully temporarily, you're talking about 10 or 11% of funding in a state by state basis that's coming. And yes, I mean, they do a lot with that. There's lots of strings attached. I mean, conservatives have been sort of fighting this for a long time. That being said, universities are entirely dependent on federally backed student loans and grants. Most universities could not operate without them. And so there's enormous bureaucratic leverage there in a way that I don't want to underplay how much the feds can mess with K-12. They can and they have, especially the Obama administration messed with discipline standards through the threat of investigation. They can put out dear colleague letters. So it's not that they can't cause havoc, and they do, but it's a lot easier. It would be a lot easier for an administration to really start to attach. I can imagine just one thing. So compliance with this Supreme Court decision, with their constitutional obligations, attaching a rider to Title IV funds, where if you are not in compliance with your constitutional obligations, and then opening like sort of a series of investigations to check that universities are in compliance, the way that the left has done with all of this stuff, right? Many, many times. So I think immediate financial consequences are actually much more relevant in the university context and much more easy to apply bureaucratically than they are both in K-12, but also, I mean, we have so many examples of this right now. At this point, with universities defying constitutional obligations, we have the First Amendment fight where, folks like FIRE or whatever go out and they win case after case after case against universities, free speech zones or whatever else, in the federal courts, and universities settle those cases, pay out every few years, and then find some new way to restrict speech on campus. Same thing with due process, right? When you have young, mostly men, college men, who are having their due process rights vindicated in court after court after court after having them violated by public universities. And yet universities continue to violate their due process rights, right? Why is that? Because they're more afraid of the woke mob on campus than they are of, having to settle a case every 5 to 10 years with somebody who really is really dedicated to having their name vindicated, right? Or their rights upheld. And they just would rather write that off as an expense of doing business. That's why I think the bureaucratic levers are so important in this particular case. And I think there are ways to do it. There are ways to make universities miserable.
Yeah.
And the left has done them all. So I feel like,
Yeah, I mean, I think even if it's a lower percentage of K through 12 funding, bureaucrats still don't like to lose money. So if they don't want to lose money, they don't want to lose money, right? It's not, whether you have 70% of your funding or it's 10%. I imagine they are responsive, which is why that the Obama administration could do all that stuff with school discipline because they did need the money.
Well, that's investigations, right? And so
Yeah.
on this specifically under civil rights law, that's one of the ways that they actually do have quite a bit of power over K-12. But on other issues like curriculum issues, even compliance with what replaced No Child Left Behind, ESSA, this sort of last one in the series of bipartisan K-12 reform attempts or whatever. I mean, there are tons of states, well, not tons, but a good handful of states that are just continually don't care about being in compliance with ESSA, and there's like very little that the feds can do about it, which I think is a good thing. Because I don't want Arizona in perfect compliance with ESSA, but I'm just saying that this is a kind of getting off track. Doesn't matter. But the point is, there are ways to make universities miserable bureaucratically if the Republican administration wanted to do so, and this decision gives them the cover to do that because they can point to it and say, no, we're just enforcing the law. We're enforcing the Supreme Court decision, and we're enforcing the Constitution.
Yeah, elections are just so important, right? So the next president will determine both like who the judges are, like, whether they want to just ignore SFFA going forward, if they just want to, be accepting of all these, all these kinds of differential treatment based on race. So it's the judges themselves, but also, the 1-2 punch of also the government and its, investigatory power. I don't know if we even need a competent Republican administration. I mean, I think just like you got to have the right appointments. And that's not trivial. But I think people sort of, I think Republicans and conservatives sort of understand, what the game is with universities. So I think either way, I think we'll get, good things happening if Republicans are in office. But yeah, I think that like as bad as the universities are, I mean, the corporate America, I mean, I see them as not really true believers. Maybe they are true believers, but they're believers in the profit motive first, and they're motivated by the profit motive first. And I think if you really bring the pressure on the Title VII stuff, you can sue for reverse discrimination and also take out the pressure for, disparate impact standard. I think we can see major changes there. I think we can see, I think the Target, thing, I think the Target thing, the Bud Light thing, just a hint of sort of what's coming here. I think business is sort of a domino that's just ripe to fall. Do you have a similar view?
I think it's possible. I mean, I think I go back and forth to what extent I believe that corporate America is true believers in a lot of this cultural commitments of theirs to diversity or whatever else. I think the younger employees, so a lot of these CEOs who are Gen X or older, are dealing with a kind of two-pronged pressure. One being from the internet mob, which is often exaggerated, but the much more important is the internal pressure from younger employees, right? And that's very real. That pressure, I don't think, is going away. But at the end of the day, I've been quite encouraged in the Disney battle, in the battle against Delta in Georgia for trying to pull out right after Georgia passed some very mild voter sort of ID kind of basic security for their elections. They kind of caved as well, Delta, afterwards, because there was a threat to take away their benefits for being the hub there in Atlanta. I've been quite encouraged by that, plus the Bud Light example and the Target examples that you mentioned. I think these companies are pressurable. And this would be look, we pressured them into this kind of initially in the 90s. I doubt that a lot of these corporations wanted to adopt this like sort of diversity mentality or for that matter, the mentality of kind of police speech in so aggressively within the corporation, like that if anyone is slightly offended by something somebody else said, that it's, that we very much pressured them into creating this entire industry around sexual harassment, racial insensitivity, blah, 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 blah. We can pressure them out of it, I hope.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I was on Steve Shu's podcast yesterday, and he said that when he talked to CEOs 20 years ago, they said they did this stuff for like affirmative action compliance, basically. But today, that you talk to a CEO and they're true believers, and I think that. But what I said was, yeah, that might be true, but there is the Robert Trivers theory of self-deception, that people will convince themselves of what's in their interest to believe, right? So you have a civil rights regime that's there for a while. People, get financial rewards for being extra sensitive. They get protection. They're less likely to be fired if they sort of lead into their identity. They're going to get in trouble. If they express a conservative view or try to have colorblind policies that have a disparate impact. And it's human nature that people will just sort of start to believe stuff over time. Right. And so some people worry like, oh, it's just like the next generation is crazy and they have these views. I think that's right. But I think people's preferences do change, given the incentive structure. So I think that's what people should understand. They shouldn't take preferences of individuals or universities or institutions or whatever as fixed, because these things will change as the law changes.
To some extent, yes. And so I think I agree with you. I think there are other countervailing forces. And I do think the younger people are, the more likely they are to be really committed. And then to that extent, the younger they are, the more likely they are to be where their career incentives and that those commitments are aligned as well. Because now we have, hundreds of thousands of people who work at very nice salaries and these kinds of compliance bureaucracies. And so, yes, I believe incentives matter. Incentives work. You can't build a system that requires of everybody to be Solzhenitsyn, right? And expect that outcomes are going to go your way. You need to provide both material incentive and also the kind of more intangible incentives, the honors that society bestows, right? You said people get awards for being the most sensitive, right? What society honors and awards, you will get more of. So yeah, I mean, I have hope. I have hope that I do think there are countervailing forces within that, but yes, I mean, ultimately, the average person is only going to be ideological to a point.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, so that's SFFA. I mean, it's I like what you said, that it's like, basically like the start of something. It's not the end. Nothing is ever the end of anything. I mean, it's always just going to lead to the next thing. And so, things are going in the right direction, and we could be happy about that. But there was also another case on the civil rights front. What was it? 303 Creative Studios versus Colorado. Is that the name of the case?
Yeah, so this is a case about a website designer. It's a free speech case, not a religious liberty case, which I've seen reported wrongly from way too many outlets, both on the left and the right. I think because it's so similar to Masterpiece Cake Shop, but there, the board, I can't remember the name of the board, but there the board evinced real religious animus, right, and bigotry, like essentially anti-religious bigotry, and that's a large part of what the case turned on, was all this evidence that the members of the board were actually discriminating against Jack Phillips because of his religion. So that's why that case was primarily done under religious liberty. This is open to everyone in a sense. This is about everybody's freedom of expression. It's called expressive conduct. You might think of it as the artist carve out in the First Amendment, the artist sort of protection in the First Amendment, that some kinds of conduct generally have this distinction, right, between conduct and speech. And the First Amendment, as a general rule, protects speech and not conduct. But sometimes you have things that's very difficult to tell whether it's conduct or speech. So, for example, if I'm following somebody down the street and I'm screaming slurs at them, but I'm following them while I'm doing that, is that free speech or is it conduct? Is it harassment for me to follow somebody? So that would be, in most states, have laws against that. But that is not protected by the First Amendment, is me following somebody down the street screaming slurs at them, right? Whereas just saying the slurs might be protected speech. Here, it's the building of a website, and it's so-called expressive conduct. So something closer to what an artist does, where you're an artist selling your knickknacks on Etsy, your paintings on Etsy. So it's a commercial transaction in some sense, right? But it's also your expression. It's your expressive conduct. And that is sort of the clearest case if you're a painter and you're painting things that somebody can't commission from you. Let's say you really, really hate Donald Trump. Somebody commissioned, I used this example earlier, right? Somebody commissions a portrait of him and, Napoleon epaulets and underneath they want inscribed, God Emperor Trump, right? And you decline that transaction, you decline that request because you don't want to paint a portrait of God Emperor Trump. Everyone kind of recognizes that as something essential to free speech. So that's really what this case is about that kind of expressive conduct. She makes websites. She's happy to accept all customers. This is really key. Another thing that continually gets muddled in mainstream media. She's happy to accept gay customers, but she doesn't want to design a wedding website for a gay marriage. So that's what this case is. I mean, this case really should have been 9-zip because the main distinction between that sometimes subtle distinction between speech and action, in this case, both parties stipulated that this was expressive conduct, meaning that it was protected speech. And I mean, I think it was Sotomayor in dissent basically ignores that fact, that both parties have already stipulated that this is expressive speech, and sort of ignores that and writes about this speech conduct distinction. But in any case, I think it's an important decision. I do think there are some implications, not from this case, but from cases like it going forward. One is going to be the tension between speech and conduct, which is kind of old hat for the Supreme Court. They may decide it one way or another, but this has been a continual problem, right? Because the line between speech and action is not always clear. But on the other axis, I think it's who these kinds of rights attach to, right? And I'll add, actually, to the first axis, I would add that ultimately run into, to some extent, a public accommodation. Now, there's no, they didn't succeed. The left hasn't succeeded in Congress in adding sexual orientation and gender identity to the Civil Rights Act, to the protected classes. But in many states, they do have SOGI laws. So the question is whether it's expressive speech or it's commercial conduct, right, and discriminatory conduct. So that's one axis that I think is going to keep getting litigated. But the other one might be who these kinds of rights attach to, whether it's religious liberty or freedom of speech. Here is sort of the easiest case because it's just one person selling one sort of artistic service as a small business. The middle case might be Hobby Lobby, which is a company held very much by I think it's called Closely Held Corporation, where it's the family was still very much in charge of this company, the single family. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you might have a large corporation, a publicly traded corporation that has shareholders, has a board, right? And the question, the sort of Mitt Romney question of, are these corporations people? Do they have religious liberty rights? Do they have free speech rights, right? Do they have the right to associate? Do they have the right to turn down entire classes of customers, right? I think that's another axis that will probably show up in the court again and again in the next few years.
Yeah. So there's a statute that protects religious freedom that says, you don't burden people for religion, but that's not what this case was decided on. This case was decided, and I see it right now, it's plainly the First Amendment. So it's not that you can just not be forced to, make a, pro-gay marriage, website if that violates your religion. Religion has stronger protections for a lot of reasons in a lot of different ways under the law. But this one actually, if I just don't like gay people, I don't want to do it. I don't agree with gay marriage. I can do that. And it's like, it's good. It's, what's that?
Or the reverse. In other words, if you had an objection, maybe you're a website designer and the Westboro Baptist Church wants you to design a website for their anti-gay rally, right? You have the right to decline to do that.
Yeah. And this is like, it's so extreme. This has to be like a question, right? Like you can literally force them to celebrate your gay wedding. The free speech protections are pretty strong under modern First Amendment jurisprudence. It just, when rights tend to run up against civil rights law, the other rights get thrown away. And that's why and the, disturbing thing is to throw LGBT, it was already bad enough for race and sex. We already sort of suspended a lot of our civil rights there, freedom of association. But and in some cases, I'm sure freedom of speech. But then you get this new category of gayness and trans. And there's no constitutional justification. Just Colorado law happens to really, really like homosexuality and dislike the anti-homosexuality view. Okay. So they feel like they could just suspend the First Amendment and 3 liberal justices will go along with that. What is driving this? It's absolutely insane.
Well, just in terms of what's driving it, it's obviously this relentless drive towards Harrison Burgian style equality, right? The Kendi
stuff is,
and of course the machinations of the left, and the hierarchy of who's more victimized and deserves higher protections and more inclusion in the protected classes. But look, this was Goldwater's objection to the Civil Rights Act, to the specific public accommodations piece of the Civil Rights Act, that it so aggressively suspends. It so aggressively suspends the right to association and the freedom of speech in various ways. that this piece, and even though he had a long record of being against segregation and fought against it in the state, and had voted for all previous versions of the Civil Rights Act that came up while he was a senator, this one he didn't agree with because he thought it suspended too much freedom. I think I used to agree with that view more than I do, in the sense that do now, that I think there is a problem that to me seems parallel, where you really have to take into account the availability of services, similar services elsewhere, right? So Goldwater's view is basically this: the free market can solve this, right? If you're excluding entire classes of customers, you're going to be losing money. Somebody else is going to come along, take those customers, provide them with the services that we need. We can live in this sort of happy libertarian utopia where all need for services is met by the free market. So even though you might not be able to force this particular designer of websites, you have endless choice of people happy to design your websites, right? So in this case, that seems true. Same thing with the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, right? Those folks were deliberately targeting Jack Phillips over and over again for these requests. There were any number of bakeries they could have gone to that would have happily fulfilled their request, right? So it seems almost like had to have an animus in a certain sense, like they're going after him again and again, trying to force him to violate his religious beliefs in order to bake this cake, right? That's where the whole meme comes from. I think it gets more complicated if we go back to the sort of analogy and the way in which the public accommodations piece of the Civil Rights Act was upheld in that Heart of Atlanta case. The problem is, if all the given businesses, in that case in a geographic area, but could be, I guess now could be digital or any other, but all the given businesses in a given market, in this case, let's say hotels along a stretch of highway that runs in the American South. If you can count on all the other hotels to exclude the same class of customer, nobody's really losing money vis-a-vis their competitors, right? So like, if every hotel along the highway for 800 miles says, I don't want to serve Black customers, then that sort of free market mechanism of, well, we're free people, we can engage in a free way. You don't want to give me you don't want to take my money and give me a service. Well, I'm going to go down the street and somebody else is going to do it. That mechanism didn't operate because they all had this cultural belief in alignment with each other. And so they could count on, and it's almost like an antitrust situation, except not in economic terms, right? It's not about economic collusion. It's about shared cultural beliefs. And I think something quite similar is happening, for example, in tech, social media companies. Until Elon Musk bought Twitter, you had sort of each one of those social media companies could count on the other ones to basically ban the same set of views and people, because they all agreed about who really needed to be banned. And in that sense, there was very little market mechanism until Elon, the sort of black swan event, right, comes in and he just buys out one of these companies and decides, okay, I'm gonna loosen up. We're gonna have a more free speech platform. You can't count on that happening in there. Anyway, I think this is actually a really, this is a complicated question of what to do when, and I guess in that sense, I have a little more respect for the public accommodations solution to this, or at least there was an underlying problem that isn't addressed by that Goldwater speech, because it assumes a kind of lack of coordination between businesses in a given field, but very much doesn't apply in these cases with like the Christian baker or with this website designer who just didn't want to design, because in those cases, those services were readily available everywhere else. It's not a matter, there's not a single gay couple in the country who cannot find somebody to design their wedding website.
Yeah, that makes it particularly absurd. You're absolutely right on that. But I would support, sort of I would sort of give, make a brief for the Goldwater case. We don't know if I don't know if that's true, that we know that like every hotel would have stayed segregated for long. Maybe that's true. Maybe it's not. Even if it's true, you could open it. I mean, that sounds like a great business opportunity. If the hotels are, you'll be literally the only hotel that can that will take Black people over 800 miles. Sounds like there's a lot of opportunities there. I mean, I think there's a good paper that I linked to on Twitter called "Prejudice is Free Discrimination as Cost," and just shows that markets are pretty good at breaking this stuff down. I mean, it's really really hard to maintain systems of segregation. Even if you do have segregation, I mean, people have preferences maybe for people of their own background. Even with that, there's nothing stopping the group from starting its own businesses, or like another group, like immigrant groups or white Northerners, carpetbaggers could come down and open hotels in the South. And if as long as there's no laws preventing them from doing that, I don't see the problem. I think it's harder with the social media censorship is like a different animal, because it's like Twitter is just Twitter. Although we have seen the market, I think the market is sort of like showing that maybe there can be alternatives to Twitter. I mean, there's this Instagram Threads thing just dropped a lot in the last day or two. But yeah, I agree with you the way we see these things, and the LGBT stuff is just so petty. I mean, so petty. These people have no problem accessing the services that they want. They're just finding the people that just finding someone to tell them no, and then picking on them. It's just so mean spirited and unnecessary. I just don't get it, and it's really frightening how divorced from principle, sort of like the liberal dissent in this case is.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is to the extent that I've kind of rethought some of my previous market commitments, I guess I could call them. It's a similar observation that this just simply doesn't play out the way that sort of market dance that Goldwater pointed to. I mean, I think in Free to Choose, Milton Friedman points to a similar kind of thing. He says, well, if you have a state broadcasting company, right, that if somebody broadcasts something that people don't like, well, then when the state controls all of the broadcasting companies, well, then there's nothing to be done. But if you have a free market and you have a bunch of you have a bunch of private news outlets, like we mostly have in the United States, right? Well, then I think he talks about book publishing as well. He says, no publisher can afford for his bottom line to publish books with which, or only publish books with which he agrees, right? And it seems to me that the problems of our current moment have had a lot to do with exactly the sort of situation that is supposedly doesn't exist in this view. And the existence of this kind of collusion was in terms of in the American South in the 50s and 60s. I think the evidence for it is the fact that something like the Green Book would have to exist, right? That there were so few providers who are willing to step out of line on this, even when it became not under the law, right? Where you had pieces of the Civil Rights Act that pieces or basically when de jure discrimination stopped being a thing, you still had this essentially this guide to the 6 people in the American South who are willing to offer services to Black people. I think that cultural collusion is quite a powerful force, and I haven't seen it play out in our current era the way that Milton Friedman said it would, or that Goldwater imagined that it would over time. Even though I think you're right, I think the free market does have, for both good and ill, has a way of sort of breaking down traditional commitments over time. So maybe on the scale of 100 years, that's true, but on the shorter time scale, I just haven't seen it happen that way.
We just never gave freedom, I mean, much of a chance to see what it could do. I mean, the Heart of Atlanta motel case was in 1964. It was the same year as the Civil Rights Act. So we did not have a period where we ever tried free markets.
It was about upholding. So basically, the question would be, does Congress have the power to pass this public accommodations piece? Surely the 14th Amendment gives them the power very clearly to pass the other piece of the Civil Rights Act, right? Which is to say what state actors can and can't do, what laws states can and can't pass. Okay, we acknowledge that there's, that Congress has the power to do that. But Heart of Atlanta was about exactly the public accommodations piece. And the argument was, where in the Constitution does the power for Congress exist to force private businesses to impinge on that exactly that right to
Right, exactly.
associate. So yeah, no, they're the same year for a reason, is what I'm saying.
But set aside. I mean, set aside. But my point was that, I mean, set aside the constitutional justification for the legal reasoning of the case. The question is like, would if you all you did in the Civil Rights Act, like Goldwater would have wanted, is just to get rid of Jim Crow, and then you let the markets let freedom go and let the markets do what they want. Like, we don't know that like you could have maintained segregation. Like, we don't know that black people wouldn't have had on the highway because we never tried the freedom. We had Jim Crow, and then we had anti-discrimination laws. We had no like period with which to even test the proposition that markets can actually work. And I think that there's a lot of historical evidence that like when groups are discriminated against, unless you actually force them apart, people chase profits. All the white Southerners, 100% of the white Southerners can be racist. Nothing is stopping black people from opening hotels. Nothing is stopping immigrants from opening hotels. Nothing is stopping white Northerners from coming in and opening hotels. People like money, right? And so I don't, this is a little bit of a digression, because what you're talking about is like today's situation. And I agree with you, that like social media censorship is potentially a problem. But I think like other things are like, not. I mean, it's not like Disney is like refusing to have conservatives at their park, or it's not like conservatives can't find hotel rooms. When barriers are entry to low, I think it's very hard to just maintain like a discriminatory system. Even if they discriminate, they bear the cost of it. Other businesses can come and take their, the social media censorship is different. I will grant that you can't just build your own Google or Twitter that easily, but most other things.
Google and Twitter, right? It's that's actually the sort of, in some sense, the least worrying aspect of the kind of social credit system, private social credit system that's possible. Right. So, we have those cases of banks who are refusing to hold the accounts of Second Amendment groups, and where it's very difficult for Second Amendment groups to find a, large national bank that will work with them because of their views, right? You can even easily imagine any number of sectors where there are a handful of major players in the market. Think about cell phones, right? There's a few major providers, where if they can just sort of arrange on the basis of shared cultural commitments that they don't want to offer phone services to, I don't know, any of these conservative litigation firms, or any number. I mean, there are just enough sectors that are not technically monopolistic. They're not. I mean, they have a handful of major competitors, and that's always been right and fine. And I'm not suggesting we move to a kind of European model on antitrust, but it doesn't seem to me that our laws currently address. And now maybe there are too many unintended consequences. Maybe there are other reasons not to address this through law, but I wouldn't dismiss out of hand the idea that it's appropriate to break that kind of cultural market share power, right? So even though each individual business doesn't have a major market share, if you have such like basically monopolistic power on the basis of shared cultural commitments towards a certain class of customer, I mean, that seems to me to be a public problem in a way that this Masterpiece Cake Shop or 303 is not a public problem, because like we both agreed, those guys can go literally anywhere for those services. But if you have a class of people who are continually denied all access to a particular like entire sector of the market, I think that is a public problem in a way that the others are not.
So yeah, speaking of which, social media censorship, I think I agree. I mean, I agree with you on that. I think that's probably like the best case for like the market can't, solve it. Although it's sort of maybe it can, because like there's a new competitor to Twitter now, on Threads. Let me ask you this. I mean, this is a question I'm curious about. I personally am not like as much of a free speech absolutist, when it comes to private companies as a lot of people are. I think that if like people are just saying false information, like there are accounts with hundreds of thousands of followers who literally just make stuff up. Right. And now we have community notes, like, okay, like, their tweet of just completely fake news will be seen by 5 million people. And then, finally community notes, some people will see that, it's not true. And so like, like I would not, be against getting rid of those people from like social media platforms. I think that just like having a world where anyone could say anything and like social media platforms like are not allowed to just, we know the use potential, but like, is it, can we just have a world where like we tell private companies that like you have to put up with any nonsense, any kind of, no matter how viral it gets, no matter how false it gets, you just have to put up with any nonsense on your platform? Is that what we have to like have in order to protect free speech?
Well, look, every social media platform does censor certain types of speech. Child porn is a type of speech not protected by the First Amendment, right? So there, nobody truly wants to be on a platform where literally you can post anything, um, in part because it becomes unusable. Uh, that being, even though we're talking about this in the private context, I think it's worth revisiting why false speech is protected to begin with under the First Amendment, and then we can move over into the private context, and you can say maybe this applies, maybe it doesn't. Um, Theoretically, obviously, doesn't apply in our current jurisprudence, but I think there's a lot of kind of backwards rationalization when it comes to why certain things are protected by the First Amendment. Chief among them what might be obscenity, right, and pornography. A lot of those decisions came about in the 60s. So in that sense, I agree with you. I'm not a free speech absolutist, but something like false speech, especially actually political false speech, it I think is right in the heart of what's really important to protect, exactly because the problem you're indicating never stops. Um, the question is false speech according to whom? And yes, there are objective standards. This is not to say that truth is relative. There are people who are objectively false and people who are objectively correct about certain things. But the question is whether a censorship regime, the person who ends up, or the entity that ends up deciding between what is and false speech, what is and isn't false speech, has its own interests always, right? And that's why that creep problem happens. It's why false speech is protected, not for its own sake. The purpose of the First Amendment is to get us closer to truth, not further away from it. But false speech is protected because, in the case of the First Amendment, we don't trust the government to be able to determine, because you might be able to find a few easy cases on either side, but then the vast majority of things are in the middle and are a matter of for example, preconceptions, axiomatic commitments prior to the. And I'll give you a really good example of this kind of fact checking from my own past. I wrote a piece a while back, years ago, about California water restrictions, right? They're in the middle of the drought. They put in some water restrictions, and I got fact checked by Snopes. Back when Snopes, I think, was a bigger deal and sort of respected across the political spectrum as being like the internet fact checker. And so the first thing that they said was, well, because I said, oh, California is going to fine you for running your laundry the same day you take a shower. And that was the tweet version. The article was more sophisticated than that, but let's say that was the tweet version. And they said, no, that's not true because these fines are assessed on the companies that provide the water. Well, that's a matter of debate in terms of, okay, but I would say those fines will immediately be passed on to the customers. Do you think that they won't be? I mean, you think that the water company is just going to eat millions of dollars of fines and not shut off people's water when they over or pass on those fines, right? That's a matter of where those fines go. That becomes immediately not a matter of fact, but a matter of preconception or ideological perspective. And then they said, hold on, there's a second example. I think these are like actually relevant in the sense that it shows how fact and perspective interplay. They said, actually, you could run your laundry and take a shower at the same time and still fall under those limits and then they picked some numbers to run it. And the numbers that they picked were, one, they assumed you have a water efficient shower head, which is more expensive, and a water efficient appliances. And they assumed that your shower would be, I think it was shorter than 10 minutes or something like that, shorter than 5 minutes. I don't remember. Right. But the point is, like, how you pick the parameters determined whether their factual statement is true or whether mine was. and that itself is such a, like, I don't think there's any non-ideological way to police those things, and that's why false speech is protected and ought to be allowed on social media platforms, in my view.
Yeah, I understand that. I mean, I wonder what sort of like, yeah, that's the classic case for free speech, and I think the problem with social media might be, and maybe this is sort of what I see, is that like when there were gatekeepers, for whatever problems they had, like you couldn't just make stuff up. Like the New York Times doesn't publish facts that are just like completely made up, right? They they're biased. They twist things in their favor. They include some things but not others, but you can't have like just completely made up stuff. And now on Twitter, like anyone could say anything, and it's sort of like a business model for these people to just say like breaking, and then just like just make up just anything. And I don't know. I'm worried that like our discourse is just sort of getting dumber and dumber. Like, what is I mean, what is this? What is the solution? Like, the solution to speech is more speech. Is it the solution? Because I see these people on Twitter, and they are, they're huge names. They're doing very, very well for themselves by just making things up. So, like, what's gonna stop them from doing that indefinitely?
The question is whether that problem is the more dangerous one or whether the censorship problem is the more dangerous one. I mean, I think anyone honest would acknowledge that there's not, the market doesn't completely police. The truth. What is it? What's the phrase? The truth. A lie can go 3 times around the world while the truth is still getting its pants on. That's sometimes very true. And the question is whether you end up trusting the American population to sort through information and make better decisions than a single gatekeeper. Like that's really what's going. That's really what this is about, right? Do you trust with that power the gatekeepers or the demos? And I mean, maybe this is a continual disagreement between you and I, but I trust the average American much more than I trust any of the elite gatekeepers in this regard. I don't think they've taken, so they in the New York Times, they might not publish some like fact about some scientific study incorrectly, but they sure will mischaracterize it in ways that I think are much more important actually than the factual thing, because in part because the factual thing is somewhat easier to check. Um, Whereas, I don't know, publishing an endless series of Pulitzer winning reporting that is just blatantly false afterwards. And I could give you 2 examples, one from, of course, the Trump Russia collusion stuff. And then going back in time, I mean, this is not just a Trump problem. I mean, Walter Duranty published endless fake news in the New York Times about the Holodomor, about the Soviet Union, factually incorrect stuff. So they have gotten a lot of things wrong, and I'd much rather put my faith in this case in the many than in the few elite gatekeepers, because I think they have a really bad track record. And yeah, so if that means that like some, I think I know the exact account you're talking about. That, like, was it the account that tweeted that the whistleblower was dead in the Biden case? It
I
was
mean,
like,
there's so many. There's so many. I mean, there's not like one in my mind. There's like
dead.
5. There's like 5 or 10 in my mind. Yeah, I mean that's one of them.
Yeah, but like people figure out, if you look at the replies under those tweets and then ultimately the community notes, like people actually figure out. I think the community notes is actually a really fair way of doing this, which is it
Yeah. Do you know this guy named
it kind of
Stu Peters?
centralizes it in a certain sense.
Do you know this guy named Stu Peters? He made the Died Suddenly movie. He's got like 250,000 Twitter followers. He works with this woman named Lauren Witzke. Do you know her? She was the Republican Senate candidate for Delaware 1 or 2 cycles ago, and she's pretty wild. She's like, so Stu Peters, like, his big thing is like Michelle Obama is really a man. He did the Died Suddenly movie, so like the vaccine is killing everyone. His big thing is Michelle Obama is really a man. That's like one of his things that he like keeps hammering on. He has video evidence of like close-ups of Michelle Obama where you can see something or other move. And he thinks the Ukraine war is fake. I mean, like everything. Like it's just an incredible guy. I was invited on his show actually. I was like, should I do this? This would be sort of fun because they like the black crime issue. So when like one of my black crime tweets went viral, they invited me on, and then like it didn't like work out. But I was actually thinking about it. Like this would actually be sort of fun just because they are so incredibly crazy. I'm more forgiving if these people are entertaining. But yeah, there's a lot of very successful crazy stuff on Twitter. Okay. Yeah, I don't know. I get it. I mean, I get it. The COVID stuff. You didn't even mention the COVID stuff. We went back to Will Durante, but yeah, the COVID stuff. My God, it was just a night.
Yeah, but there's another example where the gatekeepers were continually wrong, and it doesn't mean that every one of the sort of conspiracy-minded tweets that went viral about COVID is correct, of course, but it does mean that, I mean, you want to turn over the policing on social media to what gatekeeping entity? The CDC
No,
that's
I don't. You're
factually
right.
wrong over and over and over again during COVID? Is that really a better track record than a website that allows, among many, Alex Berenson to exist?
No, no. I mean, it might. I mean, it might. I mean, and I don't want this. I certainly don't want the CDC to do it. What I might want is like, the sort of First Amendment enforced in the way this Missouri v. Biden, the injunction that just said that the government can't be communicating with social media about this stuff, but then let social media companies maybe do what they want. I think that would probably be my preferred solution. But yeah, I mean, I get it. I get that this is a difficult question.
I just
Um,
don't. I don't trust. I do not trust. I equally mistrust our business elites as I do our government elites for different reasons. I mean, I don't. On some things, I think one might be better. On the others, I think the other one might be better. I actually, there's an interesting retreat into the public for like the public sphere, I guess, right? Because we were talking off air about what happens if, say, Uber and Lyft, the two biggest companies, they decide they don't want to serve anyone who has bad tweets, and they have a running list. It's an internal decision. If you end up on the bad tweets list, you get booted from Uber and Lyft. This is not a theoretical consideration. Laura Loomer, I believe, has been booted from both those companies, right? So
Although the Loomer thing, I think there might be like it was not like she had bad tweets about her Uber driver. It was something like this Muslim picked me up and I don't like it. So I mean, I get
whatever.
that that's sort of
I'm not in the business of defending Laura Loomer. The point is like
yeah.
that it's not a theoretical consideration. You could easily imagine it being expanded out much further than Laura Loomer. If that happens, right, there might be a retreat into the public option. Exactly, right? Where like, okay, what's left? Well, city licensed taxi drivers. Well, can the city license taxi drivers that exclude a class of people? Well, maybe not, depending on what laws in the states are passed. And so that's why I think like a lot of this is going to take place in a space where conservatives often feel uncomfortable, which is through public legislation. There's going to have to some of those quote unquote rights, they're not enforced by the First Amendment, but the American way of life that people were used to until a few years ago, fundamentally, where what you say in private or even in public in social media, but not directly as a course of your job, right? Not I'm standing representing this company and I'm saying, but like I don't know, in your personal life, has the potential to not only lose your job, but make you a untouchable in some kind of weird social credit system where you can't contract or give your money to any private ride services. You can't, let's imagine that it extends from Second Amendment people. You can't get a bank account. Your banks all drop you. You have to start putting your money under your mattress. Like that's not, I mean, I don't think that's a far out projection from where we're at because each one of those things has happened to a small group of people. And it's obvious to me that there's no limiting principle here.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I see your point. There's more that could be said here. But we have a limited time left. So I wanted to get to this. Or we haven't done a Vivek show. I think Vivek deserves more than the, 6 or 7 minutes we're going to give him here. But we could start the conversation. There was a Vox article, Vivek's Ramaswamy's, rise to semi-prominence, explain. And then the subheading is, he the GOP's candidate of ideas or a grifter? Question mark. And so, what do you think about the sort of the Vivek campaign so far? There was one poll, people shouldn't exaggerate, had him at 10 and DeSantis at 16, and like that's an outlier. Vivek has not been close to 10 in any other poll. But I thought that the young man had potential. From the time he announced, and I think he's sort of played this perfectly. You have any big
I mean, I think he has the ideas campaign. I think he's the kind of candidate who could do really well in a debate. and suddenly become sort of a viable alternative if for some reason DeSantis starts to really like fall off even from his 20%. And I think that's possible. I I guess the only thing I don't like about Vivek, and I kind of the headline with the grift, I don't think he's a grifter by any means. I think he's a smart guy who has some really smart ideas. Had him on my podcast. I really have enjoyed his books. He does have a bit of a kind of corporate motivational speaker sheen to him that is just annoying to me. It's like he seems like it's very slick and focus tested, and like at the same time he's saying some quite brave things. So it's not that I think he's a coward, but I just this sort of like slick presentation I actually don't like. But that might be something that's personal to me. I don't know how voters feel about that, but I feel often when I listen to him give a talk at a conference or whatever else that I feel like I'm listening to one of those luncheon speakers for like a corporate conference. That is the vibe to me, and I don't.
But people, yeah, but the corporate style has evolved because people, I think, do respond to it. I think that like, I do think that there's like people love like Tony Robbins, right? People love, I don't know if you remember Tony Robbins, but like these motivational speakers, which were a much bigger thing when I was a kid. People do like that. And like this does emerge in corporate America. So you're right. There is a slickness. There is a polishedness to it. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think that like one thing he does, which I think is great. And I posted a video recently of him at the Moms of Liberty conference. He really invested in, optics and production value. I went to his, he flew me out to, Columbus. I was on his podcast, some months ago. And it was really impressive. I mean, he had a professional, like a couple people, like a studio. I mean, this was just like right at the beginning when he announced, or maybe even slightly before when he announced. You could tell he'd really invested into like making a nice looking podcast. And that's like, it's like and now it's on YouTube and it looks great. You could see my interview with, Vivek there. And you're right. I mean, I think it's like, it is corporate. It's like, it's part of the whole package, but I do sort of like that. I mean, I do think that there's nothing wrong with like trying to present your ideas well and trying to, reach people, in sort of like the language that they do understand. I mean, it's like the, yeah, like, what could be sort of the downside of this? Like when you say something is corporate, like the downside would be what? It's like fake, because I don't get he's fake, right? Because that's one criticism somebody could make of like the corporate style. Like, there's some kind of like, there's some
Yeah, I
kind of
mean,
hide
I
the
think
ball,
it's
but I don't get that. I get that
inauthenticity.
like, that's a good presentation.
I think it's inauthenticity that is,
Yeah.
and that doesn't mean that the ideas that he doesn't believe in any of the ideas, but I think it comes off as packaged and inauthentic. But I think that's one that's very personal, individual
Yeah.
or whatever to people. Some people I think are going to really like that and find it professional, and some people are going to find it inauthentic and sort of suspicious, right? I do think generally this is a generational divide, actually, weirdly. Like, so for example, I know over at Breaking Points, Crystal and Sagar, they're investing a ton in having this like very professional setup, and in part they do it exactly because they want independent media to be taken seriously by the powers that be, like older people who look at some guy in a t-shirt on YouTube with a microphone and think, well, this guy isn't serious, right? Where's the suit? Where's like where's the news desk? Like, this doesn't look like real news. This looks like a bunch of people chatting behind a microphone, which I think, but there's a corresponding flip side to that, which is that there are increasingly, I think it's part of the reason that we live in quote unquote influencer culture, which has its own inauthenticities, of course. But the reason that that's powerful is that people, in the absence of being able to trust an institution, right, or being able to trust the local news or ABC or CNN, people make what they feel are sort of personal relationships with individual broadcasters or news folks or accounts they follow or whatever, and where they feel like there's a personal trust there. They've observed you over time, and there's a personal trust, and they, even when they disagree with you, they sort of count on you to correct yourself if you're factually incorrect, and so on. I think that there's a much more individual, quote quote unquote relationship that's formed there, in the absence of being able to trust institutions. And I think in that kind of news economy, or outside of the news, even in terms of choosing politicians, I mean, I think being unscripted helps Donald Trump. Right. I think people who mistrust, maybe it's not even a boomers versus younger people thing. Maybe it's just people who mistrust institutions, I think, mistrust that slickness, and that professional preparedness. And it's kind of difficult to convince them that it's not grifters, or it's not fake, or it's not. So I don't know. I think people have very polarized reactions to that kind of
Yeah.
presentation.
Yeah, I don't know if the younger generation is against like because you mentioned Crystal and Sagar. I mean, they're a younger generation, and they are, they're doing great. I mean, it
Right.
does seem like their audience, which I think leans younger, does actually. And if you look at something like Joe Rogan, which is sort of like authentic guys sitting around, you look at a studio. I mean, it's a very so it's like it is like a sort of manufactured
Yeah, but I
authenticity.
think
But
those are
there's
different things. Like, you can imagine spending a lot of money on a studio and a good microphone, but still having that very casual and authentic presentation, which I think Crystal and Sagar do. But the reason that they've spent all the money on the studio and the look, and like the reason Sagar wears a suit, which he said publicly over and over again, right, is because he wants actually to be taken seriously by people who watch. Let's say they want people like they want the Fox audience to turn over and watch Breaking Points and say, oh, like maybe this is a good independent source of media. Whereas if they tune over and it's like, Joe Rogan with a microphone, they might not. But then again, Joe Rogan is enormous, right? Joe Rogan is the biggest podcaster. And I think a large part of that, and a large part of his appeal, is that people have observed him over time. They don't feel that he's got like a presentation. They don't think he's got anything slick going on. He's there with his his hoodie, and he's just talking to people and asking questions. And I think there is an enormous appeal to that. And I don't think that necessarily correlates with having like a nice studio, by the way. But that kind of presenting yourself in that way, in a very polished way. I don't know, even in sort of my personal work, I present stuff way, way differently in the kind of conversation that we're having than when I am working with Hill staffers. Like, I will send them a, four corners memo. I'll send it over to like a graphics design team. They'll make it into like a slick PDF. It'll have bullet points. It'll have, I don't like having stuff presented to me that way. And that's why I don't conduct myself on podcasts that way. But I know how to do that. And I know that it does appeal to certain kinds of people. And I just think there's a big divide there.
Yeah, got it. Well, there's much more that can be said on like aesthetics and style and generations of presentation. There's a lot there, but we'll have to save it for next time. So good talking to you, Inez.
It's good to talk to you.